But in other cases, and the land use category is one of those, there has to be assumptions made where we lack real data or real numbers. And that's where, as I said, some of the frustrations maybe come in how these numbers can change and change fairly drastically at times. Now, the emissions can be argued in terms of some of those figures are coming from international studies or European studies. The more Irish data we get, the more refined those figures can be.
Hello, I'm Stuart Childs and you're welcome to the Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. With the land use change and forestry sector targets still to be decided, there has been much talk around rewetting of peatland. As Ireland, the Dutch and the Danes are net emitters of carbon from land, work has been done to look at areas of land involved and emission factors that are used. Pat Tuohy, Lillian O'Sullivan, Conor, Bracken and Owen Fenton have just released a paper reviewing the extent, efficacy and implications for greenhouse gas emissions and rewetting efforts of grassland peat soils in Ireland. I started by asking Pat the main purpose of this review they have completed.
Effectively, what we're trying to do here is come up with more accurate figures or argue for some more accuracy in terms of the figures that are there. I suppose, there's some background here, I suppose, would be work going into in terms of why and how some of these numbers come about and why and how some of them change. And so I suppose the background, like you said, there's a number of different sectors. If we take the broader look at the national inventory, which is a report that each country is obliged to produce every year. In Ireland, the EPA it has responsibility for that, and it's a huge body of work, as you could imagine, in terms of transport and energy and outside of agriculture and land use, which are the two of concern broadly in our side of the industry. From the land use side of things, there is a lot of there's less hard data, I suppose, out there, or hard numbers that we can hang our hat on. So in some cases, there's assumptions that would be used to try and estimate what the emissions figures are. So if you take, for example, transport, like we know exactly down to the litre how many litres of diesel or petrol are sold in a year, how many cars are on the road, what an average mileage is, how many trucks are on the road, how many commercial vehicles on the road, what the average efficiency of an engine is, how much diesel or petrol they're using. So those are all hard numbers that you can come up with a total emission value for. In the case of cattle numbers, we have the number of livestock, the ages, the diet, the emissions associated with those. Now, the emissions can be argued in terms of some of those figures are coming from international studies or European studies. The more Irish data we get, the more refined those figures can be. In terms of the amount of fertilizer that's sold or that's used, we have hard numbers or hard data again for that. But in other cases, and the land use category is one of those, there has to be assumptions made where we lack real data or real numbers. And that's where, as I said, some of the frustrations maybe come in how these numbers can change and change fairly drastically at times. But it's quite simple, I suppose, in terms of the ground rules for all this is laid down by the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which some of the listeners will probably be aware of whenever there's new agreements in terms of the international agreements. Whenever those are in the news, this is the IPCC are generally at the forefront of all that. And they lay down those ground rules in terms of reporting. And quite simply, if you didn't have assumptions and where you didn't have data, you'd have a lot of an unfair reflection in terms of what the emissions might be.
You can't choose to pass basically because you don't have the information, like.
Correct, yeah, or there mightn't be any information to it. There mightn't be past information or present information, but instead of saying we don't know, so we're going to put a zero there where there should be an emissions figure, which would obviously lead to an unworkable scenario when you're comparing country to country. They use broader assumptions that is possibly data pulled from other parts of the world or information that's a proxy for the data that's needed. In terms then of so to jump forward from that, so that's the general background in terms of how some of these numbers come about.
Yeah, so basically, Pat, like just to, I suppose to be clear, because we're very conscious that people wouldn't get the wrong idea here. So that we have to take emissions factors from other information or other data that's out there in the absence of having our own data. And like a lot of the work that's going on at the moment across Teagasc, across UCD, maybe a lot of research organisations within Ireland at the moment would be looking at trying to refine those figures, and Ben's work probably is a good example of that in relation to the methane emissions. Now, Frank O'Mara himself would have started that methane emission work back in the late 90s, probably early 2000s anyway. And there's refinements been done on that. We'll say the SF6 method that was being used has now been replaced by the green feed machines that people may have seen there at the open day recently. And that's all refining. It's not saying that necessarily what was done previously was wrong, but it's just refinement. So I suppose it's just to be clear for people that these figures can go up or could go down as well. So the refinement isn't necessarily all to drive it down. So people shouldn't rubbish the figures that are there necessarily until we know better, basically.
Yeah, and again, like at any point in time, it's the best estimate. So that given the information that's available, it's the best possible estimate. And when more accurate information becomes available, then the estimate improves. It's not that, as you say, it's all moving one direction or the other. It's that the accuracy improves. So again, that refinement is a key part of our research work, and it's the core. You mentioned UCD, you mentioned our own research side of the house. If there's a gap there to be filled, that's the bread and butter of research. We have to provide data where there is none, and that's what we're obviously very involved with at the moment in terms of the greenhouse gas side of things.
Yeah, so you're saying that there's basically there's 3.8 million hectares of mineral soils in Ireland, and the suggestion heretofore has been that there's 335,000 hectares of peat soils, which have the potential or are actually releasing carbon.
Yeah, so the current figures and the current figure that's in the national inventory for peat soil, for grassland peat soils. So the total amount of peat soil is about 1.5 million hectares. The proportion of that that's under agriculture is predominantly grassland. There's a very small proportion under cropland, but under the grassland heading, there's 335,000 hectares. Now, there is some uncertainty around that figure in terms of the definition of a peat is that you have at least 20% soil organic carbon and you have 40 centimeters depth. In theory, unless you're to go out on a very detailed ground truthing exercise, you can't detail to every acre, every hectare what exactly is peat or isn't. So there is some flexibility around that number, but it's broadly assumed or estimated to be in the 300 to 350,000 hectare range, and the figure that's used in the inventory is 335,000 hectares. There is a bit of uncertainty around that figure, but as I said, that 335,000 hectare number is fairly set.
And is it basically similar, I suppose, if you take glacial distribution, let's say when glaciers were retreating and stuff, and you can have wet spots and dry spots in the same field, is it nearly the same scenario? Like, as you said, unless you actually tested every field, you wouldn't be able to say.
Exactly, yeah. There's a huge amount of variability. And look, we've often talked about that in terms of other, broadly speaking, in terms of the mineral soils, the variability that's there, the peat soils, there's huge variability where that condition is met in terms of where that 40 centimetre depth of peat starts to appear is obviously quite variable. And there's a lot of marginal areas that are, not fully peat, but are getting to that depth. So there's a lot of potential, I suppose, for variability around those numbers in terms of the areas that are estimated. So again, that goes to show why there's some uncertainty there when we look at the actual scale of information that would be needed to get a very accurate figure on that.
Is there any scope, we'll say, for the likes of drone technology or anything like that for being able to establish those areas, and maybe have to emphasise again that these numbers could go up or could go down, but that we might be able to identify those truly more accurately, I suppose, than what we're saying now.
So there's a number of projects in play at the moment. There's one being led out of Trinity, which is looking at peat mapping that was done originally in the 1800s, believe it or not. They're trying to marry that up with, like you say, more modern technology in terms of satellite imagery, in terms of drone imagery, in terms of some ground truthing. There's other projects that we're involved with ourselves that are looking at similar methods that might be used to try and ensure the accuracy of that figure. So there's a number of those that are ongoing, Stuart, exactly in that vein.
Okay, so again, like that's just emphasizing again to people that what we're going to go on and talk about now. We're going to get into the meat of how you've kind of come up with the numbers that you've come up with there. That this is all about refinement really, and a lot of the work in the agricultural side of things is refinement. The only one question I have for you, Pat, in relation to this refinement. So I know talking to Ben and talking to Lawrence about the changes that they're getting, will say, as I said already, the SF6 versus the green feed are showing different figures, and we're able to get them into the inventory, and your figures are going to go into the inventory now as well next year, hopefully, once they're fully accepted and so forth. But like Ben says, that figure just basically dials down the figure that we had in 2018 and doesn't make a huge difference to, we still have to achieve 25%. Is what you're after doing a little bit more significant in terms of its impact in that sense?
The 25% target for agriculture remains. So, and the baseline figures might move, but the target still remains. So you still have, there's still obviously a job of work there to refine those figures or to reduce those emissions. In this case, the land use sector hasn't actually set a target, and some of the listeners will be familiar with that as well. That was delayed last year when all sectors were reported or obliged to meet targets that had been set. The land use sector was kicked down the road a small bit to the back end of this year when those targets would be set. But again, this would be a baseline change. So the percentages, whatever the percentage reduction in emissions agreed, would still need to be achieved. But I suppose it would be a percentage of a smaller total number. So it would be a less challenging saving to make. Would be the bottom line on that.
Okay, so and just on the actual emissions then from the peat soils that we're talking about, what's the suggestion there? And even actually, I suppose, just take what's the figure that the EPA are using in their inventory for those mineral soils that we're looking at the moment? And like we've already said there, that ourselves, the Danes and the Dutch, are net emitters. So just explain that balance, I suppose, in an Irish context.
Yeah, so the total land use emissions, and we can get into all sorts of numbers now, but it mightn't enlighten people too much. But the major numbers that have to be kept in mind: the total emissions from land use, which is everything: grassland, wetland, settlements, cropland, forestry, and so on. The total emissions is just over 7 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent per year. And there is some that are, for example, forestry is sequestering about 2 million tonnes. Mineral grassland soils are sequestering about 2 million tonnes as well. But the biggest contribution to that land use sector is the 9 million tonnes that are estimated to come from the peat soils on grassland. And that number is coming, as I mentioned earlier, the 335,000 hectares. One of the conditions that I was getting at earlier in terms of the ground rules on this national inventory reporting is where there is uncertainty or where there is no knowledge about the drainage status of peat soils, the rule is that they should be assumed to be drained. And I suppose that's the nub of where our argument comes from, in that our own experiences of various different programs over the years and dealing with land drainage and dealing with soil water management is that assumption isn't or wasn't reasonable. And I suppose the basis of the paper, the recent study that was out, was to try and argue against that figure, and that's what we've been doing and reasonably successfully doing, as you say now, that we're hopeful that this will be incorporated fairly soon into the inventory. With that assumption, I suppose, Stuart, there comes an associated emission factors. An emission factor is basically the rate of carbon that's released per hectare from this land use category, and quite simply that includes methane, nitrous oxide, carbon itself, off-site emissions of carbon, so dissolved carbon that will disappear off through the waterways themselves and so on. But it's all amalgamated into a carbon equivalent figure, which is about 26 to 27 tonnes per hectare. So if you get out the calculator and multiply 26 by 335,000, you'll see where the 9 million is coming from. That's the basis of that figure. But that 26 rate of emissions, 26.6 actually, that rate of emissions is coming from the assumption that this is all drained, which we're arguing against.
Yeah, so you kind of touched on it there. How have you actually discredited is probably the wrong word to do, but to use. But how are you countering the 335,000? So what have you done to come up with a number that you probably, I think, is 90,000 or 95,000 or something you're saying is more appropriate?
We're proposing a range of 90 to 120,000 hectares. And I suppose the thinking behind that is, as I said, our own experience in the ground would tell us that that's not feasible. Like, if we go back to the bread and butter in terms of land drainage, the principle of any drain, whether it's an open drain or a field drain, is that it will draw down the water table, in the vicinity of the drain. And the more difficult the soil is to drain, the more limited that effect will be. And if the effect is limited, then you need, on a per hectare basis, you need more drains per hectare. So you need very closely spaced drains to control the water table on a very difficult soil. And peat certainly meet that criteria. In terms of, there's a very high intensity of drainage required to actually control the water table. So that was our own experience. And I suppose that's all well and good, but until you have, and again, there's standards that have to be met in terms of national inventory reporting, until you can compile evidence to try and back up that argument, then you're not at a whole lot in terms of trying to change those numbers. So the basis of this paper, it doesn't actually come up with any new data, but it's delving back into the past, I suppose, in terms of various different reports and various different studies that were, some of which were freely available online, most of which were buried in archives in various different offices. And over the years, Teagasc has a very strong history in terms of the soil survey department, the soil physics department, that would have done a lot of work in the 60s, 70s and 80s in particular on land drainage and on soil classification. And it's, literally when people retired, maybe sometimes there was shelves of booklets and books and reports that were passed on through the generations. And we've all, those of us, myself and Owen and Lillian and Conor and others in the organisation have, I suppose, inherited those over the years. And it was digging through those, I suppose, and compiling all those reports and the references at the back of this paper, for those who've looked at it in detail, there's over 150 different reports and publications there that are referenced. So it's basically building evidence from those, Stuart, putting together that body of work into a reasoned argument in terms of, here is the data that will tell us what the effect is, or how effective drainage works are on peat soils, how intense the work actually needs to be. Like we've worked there, and plenty of it that shows you need drain space, less than 5 meters apart on a lot of these soils. What that would actually cost and to install day one, and what that would actually cost to maintain long term, doesn't tally with the level of income that's available off these soils, or the enterprises that are largely based on these soils. And I suppose one of the key, ultimately, when it boils down to it, I suppose there was one or two key reports that we found, and one was from a conference in 1986 that took place in the Netherlands, and again, this was stuff that was buried in various piles of reports. But a researcher from the soil physics department in that era, named Liam Galvin, who had done an awful lot of work on drainage surveys and had surveyed or taken the leadership role in terms of surveying 50,000 hectares of the country in terms of a drainage survey that was carried out in the 60s and 70s. But he reported anyway in 1986 that in the period from the late 40s to the late 80s, that there was 70,000 hectares of peat soils drained, of which 20,000 were now redundant and needed redrainage. So there was a net figure at that time of 50,000 hectares drained. And I suppose that was a very clear element of support in terms of our argument that the level of drainage was much closer to that end of the scale than the 335,000 hectare end of the scale. And we built the arguments then around that. And as I said, there's many reports that would back that up, that if the drains aren't, and I suppose it's important to say as well, we're not saying that these soils weren't drained or that they were never drained as such. There were some soils in that category that were never drained. There were some that were, some fairly low-key attempts at draining them. There was some where there was a lot of attempts, or fairly robust attempts to drain them, but it wouldn't have had the effect of controlling the water table over very wide areas. So in effect, the level of drainage was enough to have, localized effects, but it wasn't enough to drain, very large areas of these soils unless it was very intensively installed and very intensively maintained thereafter. And I suppose just to finish the point, the reason I suppose that Liam Galvin study was particularly important and that 50 to 70,000 figure was particularly important in 1986 is that it is recognized by everyone, from the Climate Change Advisory Council to our own in-house reports and various different bodies and sectors, that the period from the 1940s to 1980s, when there was a huge amount of impetus for drainage, when there was state grant aid available for land drainage and so on, and even our own, as I said, the soil physics department and the land drainage specialists were at their height of their careers.
Peak of their powers as such.
Yeah, was in that period, and as I said, that's widely recognised. So it's very significant to have a figure at the end of that period, which details that whole period and comes up with that 50 to 70,000 figure. So that was, as I said, nearly 40 years ago. So the figures that we have then is building on top of that and allowing for extra drainage to be done in coming up with our figures, which are in the 90 to 120,000 hectare range. So that's the core of the argument, really, in terms of gathering and the information, putting a shape on that argument in terms of what this information means. And putting together a new proposed emissions figure, and that's the story, or the shortened story of what's in the paper, how the paper came to be, I suppose.
Okay, so I suppose just to put it into context, basically, I have the calculator here, and I did 120,000 hectares, which is obviously the upper end. That's coming in at just short of 3.2 million tonnes of carbon CO2 equivalent, versus the just short of 9 million tonnes that you were talking about there a little while ago.
Yeah, so the ranges, and it's worth bearing in mind, the range that we have proposed is 90 to 120,000 hectares, but the emissions are 3.6 to 4.7 million tonnes. And the reason for that, it's slightly above what you proposed there, Stuart, is that the balance, so if we take the 90,000 figure from the 335, you're left with 245 there.
Oh yes, okay.
There's still emissions from those soils. Those soils don't disappear off the map, so to speak. And even as they are re-wetted or wetter than what was assumed, there's still a level of emissions from these soils. And there's still, 3.6 to 4.7 million tonnes is not an insignificant level or total emissions figure, but it's obviously a lot less than the 9 million figure. And it gives us that bit of subtlety that we were probably missing in terms of the assumption that all of these were drained.
And I suppose you mentioned the carbon flux towers and stuff like that. Now, I know you didn't mention them particularly, but the project is at NASCO, I think, that's behind that is going to further refine maybe the figures that are going to come for both the actual drain peat soils that you're talking about predominantly here, and the undrained, or the ones that are going to be re-wetted, maybe we'll say. So the effective re-wetting will come into play over the next number of years maybe, and also where soils aren't re-wetted, maybe just even the emissions that are coming from them are going to be kind of more refined over the next number of years as well.
Yeah, and that, I suppose, bears comparison with the studies you mentioned earlier from Ben Lahart and others in terms of the emission factors is the, as I said, the rate of carbon that's emitted from any particular activity. Those are based on countless international studies, sometimes having Irish specific data, sometimes not. And generally speaking, the more national or Irish specific data we can get included in those, the more accurate those estimates would be. So what the NASCO program is doing, the NASCO is the National Agricultural Soil Carbon Observatory, and people will probably be familiar with those because they've scattered emissions monitoring equipment around the country in various different parts of the country, various different soil types and various different enterprises to try and estimate, again, to try and improve accuracy, to see are the figures that we're using or that we're obliged to use without our own figures, are they reasonable or are they not? And I suppose that's the core argument of all this stuff is we can go through these reports with a fine-tooth comb and start to pull out, where the assumptions are and where they're reasonable, and that's fine, and we can go with those. But where they're not, it's our duty and our role to try and argue for more accurate or more effective numbers. And that's what it all boils down to, because it is an accounting exercise under the different categories. So it's to try and ensure that all those numbers are as accurate or as representative of the conditions that we have as possible.
Okay, so Pat, I suppose just to wrap it up really, just what are the implications for dairy farms in relation to this now? Like obviously I've spoken to you several times before about the whole heavy soils program, and there's quite a proportion of milk coming off of heavy soils, but are they all peat soils? Are they not peat soils at all? So just I suppose to give us a bit of context around that.
Yeah, so there's a number. If you take those farms that we're involved with over the years, you'll have probably less than, you'll have 8 to 10% of those by land area will be organic or peat soils, and that is probably reflected in a proportion of the dairy farms that are out there. So it's relatively low proportions, but I suppose the key thing here is that the broader policy going forward on these peat soils is now coming from a much more accurate figure, I suppose. So where the policy leads us, I suppose, and I suppose the nature restoration law and similar laws and proposals over the last few years have been getting a lot of attention in the media, and there still will be a call there in terms of restoration. Obviously, like what I suppose should be remembered is that when we're categorizing stuff, be it the National Inventory Report or generally when policy is coming on these soils or different areas, is that it tends to be things tend to be looked at in black and white terms, and the case here is obviously what I've been talking about in terms of drained or not drained, and there's also that coming along the line in terms of restored or not restored. What we're proposing and arguing for all the time is a bit more subtlety, in that it's recognised that there's a gradient of drainage across these soils. There is shades of grey, I suppose, to put it, in terms of instead of black and white, in terms of drained or not drained. Some of these soils are, as I said, were never drained. Some of these are seasonally drained. Some of these are very well drained. And they're not all starting from the same point, I suppose, Stuart. And what the nature restoration law or the proposals might mean for them then obviously needs to be aware of that fact. And I suppose the level of restoration that might be required is going to be, again, follow shades of grey as opposed to a black and white yes no scenario. So that remains to be seen, really. But this work, I suppose, gives us more accurate figures. It doesn't necessarily get rid of any of those proposals that are coming down the line. They're still going to be very much in play in terms of future policy up to 2030 and up to 2040 and beyond, and maybe beyond when we get retired, Stuart, maybe still going on in terms of debating what way they're going to go. But as I said, there's different starting points for different soils. There's huge variability in terms of soil type, in terms of water table depth, in terms of management, in terms of enterprises, and that will need to be reflected, would be my view, in terms of what the policy would be going forward with these areas. Okay, so while it mightn't directly impact on individual sectors, it's the country's whole situation is what's been improved, I suppose, by what yourself and Owen and Lillian and Conor have done there in the last couple of years, a year or two, I suppose. Probably a nice bit of work and going back through all that kind of old data and heavy going, trying to, when it's not in the computer screen and easy to search, there's a bit of digging to be done. Yeah, a bit of digging, but we're used to that. We've plenty of that done, Stuart.
You're used to digging in the heavy soils program. Very good, Pat. So thanks very much for coming on today and enlightening people on that most very recent publication that you have. That's obviously going to have a big benefit to the industry as a whole. As I said, even though it mightn't directly impact on individual farms, it's important for the whole industry. So thanks for doing it, I suppose, and thanks for coming on to talk to me about it.
No problem, Stuart.
That's all for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast, and my thanks to Pat Tuohy for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. And for more information, go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Stuart Childs, and join me next time for your Dairy Edge.